Hebrews chapter 1 and the first 4 verses. In the past, God spoke to our forefathers through the prophets at many times and in various ways. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he had provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. When we write a letter, we start by addressing the person we're sending it to, dear so-and-so. And then we finish with our own name, yours faithfully, yours sincerely, whatever we use. In New Testament times, the name of both the writer and the recipient of the letter were usually included at the start of the letter. So, for example, in the letter that comes immediately before Hebrews, the letter to Philemon, it starts, Paul, a prisoner of Christ Jesus, and Timothy, our brother, to Philemon, our dear friend and fellow worker. The letter to the Hebrews, this part is missing. We don't know who wrote it, and we don't know who received it. It was not an anonymous letter originally, thus that part has somehow been lost. The writer knew the readers knew the writer, and there are some personal details at the end that indicate that. It's clear from reading it that it was written to a church with a lot of Jewish Christians. And the writer uses the Old Testament, the Jewish scriptures, to explain who Jesus is and why Jesus is not just one amongst many, but unique, and to explain what Jesus has done. And about once a month or so, we're going to look at this letter and ask the simple question, who is Jesus? Today, we see that Jesus is God himself come to save us. Let's read that list again, because it's really quite an amazing list describing who Jesus is and what he's done. He has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed heir of all things, and through whom he made the universe. The Son is the radiance of God's glory and the exact representation of his being, sustaining all things by his powerful word. After he'd provided purification for sins, he sat down at the right hand of the Majesty in heaven. So Jesus is God's way of speaking to us. In times past, God sent prophets and others to tell people about himself. You can read the stories all through the Old Testament. But his ultimate, his perfect communication was to come as Jesus, to live amongst people, and to tell and show what God is like and what he wants us to do and be. The writer says Jesus is appointed as the heir of all things. What that means is he is the King of Kings, the Lord of Lords, the ruler of the universe. He says that God used Jesus to create the universe. This is an especially important thing for the readers to see, because the Jews acknowledged that nobody could create except God. This was only something that God could do. So in saying that the universe was created through Jesus, the writer is beginning to say Jesus is God. He describes him as the radiance of God's glory. If you want to see how wonderful God is, look at Jesus. And he's the exact representation of God. He shows us what God is like. His words, his action, his being show us God. To see God, look at Jesus. He sustains the universe. Again, a role ascribed solely to God. He keeps everything going. And then finally in this description, it speaks about him as the purifier of sins. His purpose in coming to earth was to show us what God is like, but also from the very beginning to die on the cross and provide forgiveness for all who will receive it. We've heard the story so many times, we take it for granted. But it's incredible, first of all, that God should come as a human being. But even more incredible that having come, it should be for the purpose of dying for his people. Yet that's what it's for. There was a gap between us and God created by our sin. We couldn't access God on our own. We had no right to come before God except to expect judgment. And we could do nothing about it. So God himself acted, and Jesus became the purifier of sins, the one who could wash sins away, the one who could grant forgiveness, because he lived a perfect life. He committed no sin, and yet he bore the punishment for our sin and died in our place. That forgiveness, that salvation, is available to all who want it. If you've not received Jesus, do it now. It doesn't matter that you're not sat in church. You don't have to be in church to meet with Jesus. It doesn't matter that it's lockdown. It doesn't matter about where you are, what time it is, what you're doing. If you know that your life's a mess and that you want Jesus to put it right, reach out to him. Just ask him to come, to forgive you, to give you a fresh start. And then find somebody who already knows Jesus and talk it through with them and move on from there. And if you are already a Christian, thank God for Jesus. Thank him for his love, his grace, his forgiveness. And then finally, in this passage, the writer says he is now in heaven at the right hand of God. That's a sign that his work has been accomplished in forgiveness and that he is now there in heaven with God, waiting for the end of times. C.S. Lewis, probably best known these days as writer of the Narnia books, though he wrote a lot of other books on Christian themes, particularly explaining different aspects of the Christian faith, wrote in his book, Mere Christianity, that there are only 3 sensible ways to think about Jesus. He was either mad, bad, or God. You see, when somebody says to us that they're God, we automatically think, oh, well, there's something a bit odd about them. And if they really push it and pursue it and make it a big feature of their life, then we think they've got, what we'd say today, mental health problems. There's something wrong with them. And you can look at Jesus and see that he quite clearly claims to be God. And the Bible claims him to be God. So we could say, well, this is just somebody who was unstable, somebody who was disturbed, somebody who was mad. And yet, the words of Jesus, the teaching of Jesus, have transformed human history. How could that happen if they're the words of a madman? Well, also we can meet people today who claim to be God, and we know they're con men. We know that they're doing it to gather a group of gullible disciples and to fleece them of their money and everything else. And we could say of Jesus, well, that's what he was. He was just a con merchant. If he wasn't mad, he was bad. Well, if he was a con merchant, again we have that problem of how does this incredible teaching come from such a dishonest person? But also he wasn't a very good con man. He got nothing out of it. He didn't make himself rich. He didn't benefit from all his actions, his claims to be God. He ended up dying on a cross. And the third option is that he is who he says he is. That he is God. God himself in human form, living as a man, experiencing all that we experience, even to death, and then being raised to life again. Jesus is God. God himself, come to save us.